it's thought that it's a reference to the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 apostles, and so you've got believers under the old covenant, believers under the new covenant. You've got all believers of all time represented there by those 24 elders. In other words, all believers of all time are there. But also, whoa, we've got a visitor. I have never seen such cowardice.
About to hit the needle.
So all believers are at this scene in the presence of God, and God is there in all of his glory. You talked, Charlie, about when will we see him. We see him then. And the description is otherworldly. John obviously doesn't have the vocabulary to explain what he sees, but he sees something. God is there. All believers of all time are there. All of God's people of all time are there. All the divine beings are there. We call them angels sometimes. All of the heavenly hosts are there. Cherubim, seraphim, these different levels. Hey everybody, it's Thursday night. That means it's time for AMA, Ask Me Anything. My name is Pete Baker with Alta Vista Assembly in beautiful bucolic East Bakersfield, California. We're going to be with you for the next 30 minutes or so and take your questions. And I don't know that we're always going to give you a definitive answer, but we will address them. And that's the point of the thing, isn't it, Matthew? You know, people are allowed here to ask questions that maybe they'd be a little sheepish about asking. Say they're a mean old pastor or somebody.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, you know, we're open to that. I'm joined tonight, as always, by Matthew. Matthew, I am primed. I am armed and ready. I've got my little Virginia Slims iced tea here.
Virginia Slims, that's exactly right.
That's a dated reference. Greet the people and tell them how we play the game.
Hello everybody, I hope you're having a wonderful Thursday night. The way it works is, as Pastor Pete said, if you have a question that you would not necessarily otherwise feel comfortable asking, you can send them in the comments section or send us a direct message to the Alta Vista Assembly Facebook, and we can read those ones anonymously. And that's kind of just how it works right there. Oh, all right, I put the wrong nameplate up.
There we go.
There we go. So that's how it works.
All right. You know, before we get started, I mocked this, but it is actually pretty good.
It's
fairly tasty. Yeah.
Good. Okay.
I'm
just glad you can hold it because of the.
I don't want a lawsuit or anything.
They make it real small.
I don't want Trader Joe's coming down my throat.
That would be bad.
All right. Well, you may fire when ready, sir.
Okay. First question: how should I think about God?
There are probably multiple ways to think about God, but when I kind of think about this question, and there are great books written on it. Mortimer Adler, who was a genuine philosopher, American philosopher, he wrote a book by that title, How Should We Think About God? So there are probably multiple ways, but when I think about it, really it comes under two ways, roughly speaking, that you might think about God. So let me suggest those. One of them I would highly recommend. The other I do not. But let's look at them both, because I think pretty much everything falls into these two. There are multiple ways. There are always, when you talk about a question like this, there are vocabulary differences and all of that. But two broad categories here. One of the ways you can think about God, and it's perfectly reasonable and logical to think about God this way, is to look around. And by observation, you say, the universe seems to run fairly efficiently. I mean, we don't have too many cases where asteroids are banging into each other and that sort of thing. And on the whole, most things work pretty well most of the time. And so it's easy to conclude from that, and you probably should conclude from that, they seem to be run by certain, we call them laws of nature, gravity, entropy, so on. And you would be right. It does seem to run along some kind of rules. It's not hard then from that to say, well, if there are rules, maybe very probably they were established by a ruler of some kind. So far, you're onto something. But where it kind of goes off the rails is when you begin to think, as we do, because we're selfish little creatures and we always think everything revolves around us and is about us, you begin to think, well, for me, that means that if there is a ruler and he has rules that apply to nature, maybe he has rules that apply morally as well, or to my behavior as well. And if so, very likely I have broken some of those rules. And again, you would be absolutely correct in that. But then we begin to go a step further and imagine that that ruler must be angry because I have broken, and I must do something to appease that ruler, to assuage his anger. And that, in a nutshell, is what a lot of world religions historically have been. You have a God who is offended, and you must placate him somehow. Otherwise, you're going to reap the whirlwind for your behavior. So the idea that there are rules that the thing seems to run by, then you say, oh, well, there must be a ruler, and I have broken the rules. I am now in big trouble. That's one way to think about God, but I would suggest that that is a way fraught with all kinds of emotional disaster, because as somebody has said, that is like a goat path going over a cliff. You begin to walk that path, that God is primarily a ruler, first a ruler, and that I have broken his rules, and therefore I have offended him, possibly angered him, and I'm in big, big trouble. You set in motion then a way of thinking that can become very toxic. But that is the way a lot of people, I would probably submit that most people, even most people that self-identify as Christians or Jesus followers or theists, that is the way most people think about God, that he is an offended ruler and I'm in big, big, big trouble. That's one way, and I would suggest that it is not a healthy way. There's another way to think about God, and it's bound up in some things that Jesus had to say. He said at one point in his high priestly prayer, and we don't have time to talk about what that was and all the ramifications for that, but it seems that that prayer was heard and recorded by his followers because Jesus was praying it loudly with a loud voice. The book of Hebrews says he was heard for his loud crying. And on the event that we call the Garden of Gethsemane, his last night on earth, he is praying some distance, a stone's throw, from his followers. But if he's praying loudly, that's how they're able to hear it, remember it, record it. And the way they record it is Jesus saying at one point in that prayer to the Father, he says, Father, I want you to restore, I want you to love them with the same love that you had for me from the beginning. From the beginning, he says, of creation. So what that means is that from the very beginning of creation and before, the beginning of the relationship that is Father, Son, and Spirit, that God has always related as a father. In other words, before he was a ruler, before creation, Jesus says, you were a father. Before he was a ruler, because there was no creation to rule over, before he was a creator or a ruler, he was first a father. And I would suggest that that is probably a better way. It is certainly a more biblical way to think about God than to think about him primarily as a ruler. He is a father with the heart of a father. And what he does out of a father's heart. He doesn't do out of an offended ruler's heart. Which completely shoots to pieces the notion that Jesus had to die in our place to satisfy the wrath of God. That is not what the Bible indicates by the nature of God. That he is first a father with a father's heart, and that's why Jesus comes. First and foremost and primarily to express the Father's heart to us. So you want to know what the Father's heart is, look at Jesus. Don't look at some of the outworn theologies that insist it's a case of Jesus having to placate the wrath of the Father by his death. In other words, you wind up then with some weird, the Father kills the Son to satisfy his wrath. That's not a God I want to have much to do with. Fortunately, it is not the God of the Bible. It is the God of many theologies, but I would suggest that those are off the rails because they start first with the idea that God is a ruler, but the Bible says very clearly from the lips of Jesus Before God was a ruler, he was a father. That's the best way to think about God.
All right. What is Christian nationalism, and is it dangerous?
Second part first, I think yes. But maybe not.
Second part, you're answering the second part first.
Yes,
Okay.
is it dangerous? Yes. But probably, in my thinking, primarily not for the reasons that much of the media thinks it's dangerous. Let me explain. Christian nationalism, I cringe anytime, and I feel some offense anytime the word Christian is used as an adjective that is put to something. My problem with it is the Jesus that I know is enough. Jesus Christ is enough. I don't need to add nationalism to Jesus Christ. And if anybody feels that you have to add nationalism or anything else to Jesus, you have not encountered the same Jesus Christ that I have, because Jesus is enough. It is not a case ever of Jesus plus anything. So that's my initial problem with Christian nationalism, but it's my problem with anything that uses the word Christian as an adjective. So let me deal with it a little more pointedly. Yes, it is dangerous, and it's dangerous, again, to my thinking, primarily to Christianity. It is dangerous to the church. It's frequently been done on the left and the right that people add things to Jesus, that they add Jesus to things, and they come up with all kinds of concoctions. But in every case, it's Jesus plus nothing. I don't need to add anything, whether it's from the left or the right or nationalism or anything. I don't need to add it. The miracle that is Jesus stands alone. It doesn't need any supplements, and it certainly doesn't need nationalism to be added to be good. It's always a case that when you add anything to Jesus, it's a diminution of Jesus. It's a devaluing, it's a diluting of the message of Christ, the gospel, the message of good. And that's exactly what happens with Christian nationalism or any other ism that adds the name Christ to it. It boosts the other thing, but it diminishes Jesus. Got a real problem with that. What that means in effect is that the nationalism part is a parasite on Jesus. It's a parasite on the message of good. Whatever Christian nationalism purports to be, it is by definition a parasite. It has attached itself to Christian, to Jesus. And it, like any parasite, it's doing that to draw strength from the host. So there is my basic philosophic problem with Christian nationalism, but it's my problem with using Christian as an adverb, period. Don't add Christian to anything else, because you're being a parasite there. Now, to speak directly, the whole premise of Christian nationalism, to my understanding, is built on the idea that America is a Christian nation. It was destined to be a Christian nation. That is historically mistaken. That is a mistaken premise. We were never established as a theocracy. Now, was it established with some Christian principles and some biblical underpinnings that informed it? Most definitely. The people that were the founders and the pre-founders, those were people that they lived in that environment. The Bible and the teachings of the Bible and the ethos of the Bible as it had come to them was that's just the water they swam in. Now, it wasn't the only water they swam in. Our founders and our pre-founders were also steeped in classical literature, Greek, Roman, Cicero, Seneca, so on. And that informed much of what they did, thank God, because what they did was take all of that, the classical education that they had, plus the Christian underpinnings, the biblical underpinnings, and they spun out a pretty remarkable thing. But they never intended it to be a theocracy, a Christian nation, and they never, obviously, and it's even in the founding documents, that there would be an established church. And so Christian nationalism is, to my thinking, built on a mistaken premise that we're to be a Christian nation. I don't think that was ever intended. I would say divorce the nationalism from the Christian, and you want to argue nationalism? Knock yourself out, but let it stand on its own. Don't be a parasite on the Christian part, on Christ, because that was never intended. Let me just deal before we stop, because I've just kind of been dancing around it with the philosophy of it, and the problem I've got with that and the structure of it. Let me just talk for a second about the internals of what I understand it is. My understanding of Christian nationalism is that they want to influence internal domestic politics. I don't think they're so much concerned with foreign affairs, but they're very concerned about internal American politics on the state level, local level, certainly the federal level. And they want those internal politics within our nation at every level to reflect Christian ideas, Christian themes, Christian doctrines. That's what they want. And they want it to be woven into the fabric of our legal system and everything else, explicitly, not tacitly, not quietly, not as an underpinning, but they want it to be explicit. That's what I understand that they're trying to do, to influence the internal politics of our nation and have it reflect Christian ideas. In countries where this has been done in spades, they end up with established churches, national churches. If the Christian nationalists would look for just a second at the results of what they're driving for, they wouldn't be very happy, because in those nations that do have an established church, a national church, it never bodes well for the church. It always weakens the church to be yoked like that. And so if they would just look around them and stop listening to their own priors and just open their eyes, they'd see that what they're looking for doesn't work even when you do it. It doesn't work well. We have never, as I said, been a Christian nation. It would be wrong, though, to say and conclude from that there is no significant Christian influence upon our nation. That would not be accurate either, because there clearly is. And in fact, it was such a profound impact. And it's some ideas that go all the way back to Athanasius and the 5th century, and how you think about human beings and that have affected our nation. Those are some very significant Christian philosophic ideas, and they definitely are there. And we have, for all these years, been living off the social capital of a lot of that to our benefit. Just the way we do a lot of things has been informed by the biblical text. So it would be wrong to say we haven't been influenced. We most certainly have, and to our benefit, and we're still living off that social capital. And our society is informed by Christian ideals, and that has been a good thing. That is not the same thing as saying we should be a Christian nation. But let me just end it with this. As I said, I don't like using the word Christian as an adjective. Christian music, Christian novels, Christian stores, Christian clothing. I don't like that at all, and I certainly don't like Christian nationalism for that reason, but for the internal reasons I've said, I don't think it's valid. I would say this, if I had the ability, I would say I want you to stop saying Christian nationalism. I want you to stop saying Christian socialism. I want you to stop saying Christian science. I want you to stop saying Christian social justice. Because in every case, you're being a parasite attaching to the healthier host. And you're trying to draw your life and your bona fides from that. Let your argument rise or fall as it will in the court of public opinion. But Christian nationalists, please take the word Christian out. Do whatever you want to do, but stop calling it Christian.
Okay. Let's see this one. Does evolution disprove creationism?
You know, this is an either-or, kind of a spy versus spy, you know, good versus bad. This is an argument, a dogfight that's been around for a long time. It goes back to the early 1900s when there were groups of Christians issuing what they called the fundamentals doctrinal statements that came to be called the basis for what was called Christian fundamentalism. There it is again. And it reached its apex, I guess, if you would think of it that way, in the 1925 Scopes trial in Dayton, Tennessee, where a guy by the name of John Scopes, who was a high school biology teacher, was put on trial for teaching evolution, which by the Constitution of Tennessee, his state, was explicitly forbidden in what was called the Butler Act. But he was charged with, and he stood trial for that charge. It does seem that John Scopes himself, he could not recall ever in the classroom having actually taught evolution, but he did have a textbook that talked about it, and he allowed himself to be a test case. But anyway, it turned into a real media circus, partly because people like H.L. Mencken, the great Baltimore journalist, gave it the title The Monkey Trial, and that's the way we remember it. And really, a lot of people hyped it up. Representing the prosecution, they got a fellow by the name of William Jennings Bryan, three-time presidential candidate, obviously never successful, but a stalwart Bible-believing Christian, and he was going to bring the case against Scopes for the state. And Clarence Darrow was called in, the great attorney, civil rights attorney, was called in by the ACLU to defend Scopes. He initially didn't want anything to do with it because he said it will devolve into a circus, which it did. He only signed on because without me or with me, he said it's going to be a circus, so he took the case. Anyway, it's a super interesting case, but that's where this whole us versus them, one side versus the other side, really had its apex, and we're still living in the shadow of the Scopes trial and the way we think about creationism versus evolution. Let me just say this, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an expert, but it does seem to me that the whole idea of creation, where it all started, the initial origin, the first cause, that is probably outside the purview of science. If it's within the purview of anything, it would be within the purview of philosophy and theology. But I don't think science has much to say about how it started. Science has much to say about the results of creation, or how it all came to be here, and the elements and life and biology and all the rest. It has much to say about that because the scientific method is to investigate, to come up with a hypothesis, here's how it might have happened, that could morph into a theory, and then to conduct experiments somehow that are repeatable, and that helps you to establish the truth of what you're saying, your theory. That's what science does. But as far as how it all started, science can comment on the elements, science can comment on what we see and the evidence around us, but how it got here, science is really tough. That's really outside their purview. What started? The best many can claim is a Big Bang, whatever that means. Well, what was there before the Big Bang? What caused the Big Bang? We don't know. We don't know. They know a lot, but they don't really know the origin story. That still eludes. And I think that's really outside of their purview. Because science deals with what is. It deals with it's limited to the evidence that it has before it. And that evidence is not there. It's beyond it. It's philosophy. It's theology, and when science endeavors to comment on that origin, it's still just philosophy and it's speculation. So, setting that aside, if you see validity in evolution, okay, that's fine. But realize that the theory of evolution, as it's understood, as it's practiced, as it has become the go-to theory, that it is not without its blind spots. We call that lacunae. It's not without its blind spots. And it doesn't answer everything. It is, to a fair observer, the theory of evolution is not airtight. It is far from being a theory of everything, but if you feel that it addresses some issues and it answers some questions and it ties up some loose ends, that's fine. You can think that if you please, that's fine. And if you see evidence for it, fine. And if you can show me evidence for it, fine. But it is not a theory of everything. And it really is not in opposition to creation because, again, creation is outside the bounds of science. Evolution is within the bounds of science. But I can't see that the theory of evolution rules out creation. I don't see that it's in opposition to it. I don't see that it addresses it at all, and it certainly cannot rule it out. It's not big enough to do that because creation is a bigger thing than evolution. So it can't do that. I believe that it all originated in the mind of God. And the mind of God is way beyond any theory. Otherwise, he's not God. You can't capture lightning in a bottle. And if science believes that it has answered the ultimate question, that's exactly what it's done. It's tried to catch lightning in a bottle. But I don't see an opposition on either or. If you favor some parts of evolution, just understand it is not airtight. It is not without its questions and blind spots. It's not a theory of everything.
Okay, we've got time for one more here. What's the hardest part about being a pastor?
You know, there are hard things to it. It's become real apparent to me that here post-COVID, post-lockdown, that whole scene had a humongous, tremendous, largely negative effect, especially in the American church, because we really suffered with lockdown. Church leaders really suffered. If they did lock down, they were much criticized, sometimes within, their own camp. Within their own church, pastors couldn't do, if they did one thing, it upset other people. If they did another, it was a no-win. And it's taken its real toll on church leaders. There have been massive resignations of church leaders. There have been record numbers of churches closing because they don't have leaders. The current environment is beating the stuffings out of a lot of church leaders, a lot of pastors. This is a tough time. And I know a number of them personally who've just thrown their hands up post-pandemic and said it's too hard. People have gotten, even church attenders, have gotten very lax in their attendance, and it's just very hard. And many, many pastors are faced with the difficulty of these people only call me when they need a funeral, or they need a wedding, or their kid is in jail, or they need counseling, but they are not part of the living church. And it's taken its toll emotionally on a lot of church leaders. I just heard of another, it makes the third that I've heard, that has resigned. I've heard of many more that have resigned, but 3 that I know of that have resigned have sold their home, sold everything, bought a mobile home or motor home, and just taken off. They don't want to be attached to any place. I mean, it's affected them and their family that badly that we just want to go. We just want to get out of here, and we don't want to be responsible for anybody or be tied down to any place. And they're living kind of a nomadic existence because they've been really driven away by all this. So all that to say, these are tough days to be a pastor and to hang in there. In our particular case, in my church, we have just an overwhelming number of level-headed people, and we have pushed through all of that and reopening and everything, and we had no dissension within our church, so that didn't take a toll on me. What was hard for me was I couldn't be with people in crisis time, in the hospital or in their homes, but that was my problem. So it's a tough time. I would say there are a couple things that are really the hardest. One is you find yourself very vulnerable. You give. You think you have established a relationship with people, and then American Christians can be extremely fickle, and you help them through a tough time, a death, a significant crisis, or kids in jail, or just it runs the gamut. and you think you've established a relationship with them, and then they find somewhere else to go where animals are popping out of the buildings, or the light show is more impressive, or the coffee is brewed better, or some fickle, silly reason, and they pursue the trivia, and they're gone. And you're left thinking, I thought we had a relationship. You make yourself very vulnerable, is what I'm saying. So that is one of the harder things that's hard for a pastor in our day. I think we're facing challenges where, and this would be the second thing that's hard, is you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. There seems to be a cadre of people out there, talking heads and all sorts of people that are kind of gleeful that churches seem to be in decline. That's pretty hard to hear when this is what you've given your whole life to. And now there are people that are happy that the church is in decline. That's tough to take, because you know that we live in a society that, as I said earlier, is living off the social capital of the gospel, of what the churches have done, and the good seasoning that they put into a community. That cities are living off of that now, and the good teaching and so on that went into people's lives. How much longer we're going to be able to do that and still, stomp on the head of the church, I don't know. Because, as I say, leaders are jumping ship because it's getting too hard. So it's tough to see the thing that you've given your life to denigrated by people on the outside, and with people not returning back to church, people on the inside devaluing it. When you know that the church is a sacred thing, the Bible says Jesus Christ died for the church, but many people treat it as an option. And that's just a couple of the things that make it kind of tough. In my particular case, there's the good way outweighs the bad, because we have a fantastic church of people who get it, that they love the Lord, they practice it, they're busy doing the work of Christ during the week, and I don't even know all the good things people are doing. We don't have it organized that you go do this and you go do, they're just living it, and that is personally very gratifying, and it makes my job much easier. With the advent of our Thrive program and people discipling each other, it makes my job easier. I just show up and just enjoy everybody's company. So for me, it's maybe a little bit different, but that's some of the frustrations I know that pastors are facing. So is that it, Skippy?
That is it.
Well, listen, thanks everybody. It's been a joy that you have joined us for these few moments. I hope it has been beneficial. We still have a few backlog questions, such as, what do we have left?
Hold on here. We have, what's between the Old Testament and the New Testament?
Oh, I can't wait to get to that one.
And then, what does it mean to have the fear of God?
Excellent, outstanding. Well, listen, we'll tackle those first thing next week. Do join us then, next Thursday, 6:30, live stream on the Alta Vista Assembly Facebook page. We are with Alta Vista Assembly in beautiful Bucolic, East Bakersfield, and if you do not have a church home and you're in our area this coming Lord's Day, you would be most welcome. 10 a.m., 529 Crawford Street is the time and location, and as I say, you would be a welcome guest. So listen, if listening to this and you do come on Sunday, come up and introduce yourself to Matthew or I, and let us know you're there, and that'll be especially pleasing to us. So 10 o'clock, 529 Crawford Street. We always live stream the 10 a.m. as we live stream this on the Alta Vista Assembly Facebook page and now on YouTube. So you can catch us live or live stream, and whichever way we meet next time, let's do our